Good morning, folks. I'm super excited to be hosting Jim Rutt. Jim is the former CEO of Network Solutions, which operated the .com, .net, .org domain. He was one of the first CTO of Thomson Reuters. And pretty much at the beginning, he was at the beginning of the information technology revolution. He's currently a trustee at the Santa Fe Institute, and working on something which caught our attention at Mu Sigma is the scientific study on consciousness and artificial intelligence. So we are again super excited to be hosting him. Jim, welcome to the Mu Sigma ecosystem.
Dhiraj, great to be with you. We had a wonderful kind of get to know each other chat, a month or so ago, and I've been looking forward to this. I think this should be very interesting.
So Jim, I'll maybe start off with your perspective. You were part of one of the most initial journeys of internet. From where you came from that place to what you are doing right now, which is where your focus is on complexity science. Tell us a little bit about your journey and what drove your interest towards complexity science.
That's a great question. Yeah, and I actually got involved in what we now think of as the internet long before it was the internet. I went to work for a company called The Source in 1980, which was the very first consumer online service that anybody with a computer, of course there weren't that many people who had computers in 1980, could sign up for our online service. And we had email and chat and shopping, stock prices, bulletin boards, you name it. That was where to be. We quickly had tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of customers. And it was very interesting to be there more or less at the beginning, and to have watched it evolve to today, where it is a goodly part of what the world is. And so I left there after a little bit less than 2 years when the company was acquired by a big, dumb multinational, and went off and started a company with another guy. And we took the skills that we developed at The Source, which was to build very low cost, because we're aiming at the consumer, ways of delivering information. And we targeted them to Wall Street and to corporate America. There was actually a group of 4 companies that we built from 1982 or thereabouts to then in 1986. We sold them as a package to Thomson Corporation, now Thomson Reuters. And I stuck around for a little while. Well, actually, I retired after I'd left Thomson. Retired for 2 days when the friend of mine wanted to start a new company, and he called me up, and I said, "Oh, sure, I'll help you." Well, anyway, that company turned out to be T-Mobile, the cellular company. It was actually one of the main components that went into T-Mobile, which was
sure.
a roll-up. And then I did another thing, sold that, and then retired again, lasted 2 months. And then when I was, just working on, and then I did a little just for fun, a micro startup. I said, let me see, what can I do just for fun for one person? And I did, which was to develop the first professional bulletin board and file sharing site for Visual Basic programmers. And I had a deal with Microsoft. And then I got sucked back into corporate America, allegedly on a 3-day consulting assignment back into Thomson. I built a lab, and I built a consulting organization. Actually, I took a small consulting organization we already had and built it up to 500 people and technical consulting. We had Thomson Labs. We did all kinds of cool stuff. And then I will say it was a good call. We got Thomson across the line to the internet faster than our competitors. We went from number 4 in the league tables of professional information publishing to number 1 in a 10-year period. And so I really did enjoy working for them. But then I got an offer I couldn't refuse. Story of my life, right? Turned out that Network Solutions, who were the evil monopolist runner of the domain name system back for most of the 90s. And as you would imagine, a monopolist was not a very good company. I mean, it was pretty crappy in lots of ways. And by chance, they were about a 5-minute drive from my office, my Thomson technical research headquarters in Northern Virginia. And the headhunter called me up and said, "Oh, you're on a list of 60 that they'd like to talk to you about the CEO job." And I go, So I cynically said, well, I'll go over there if I can get a free lunch. And so I went over and interviewed and got a free lunch. And so I went to work for Network Solutions. And I brought in lots of good people that I knew. And we attacked all the problems, articulated a strategy, resolved all of our issues with the government, and just, totally changed the pace of the organization. And, the stock market value went up, just kept going up and up and up and up and up and up. We did the biggest secondary stock offering, might still be in history on the internet. We raised $2.2 billion in around 1997, I think it was. I read a 1-paragraph super summary book review of John Holland's book on genetic algorithms, which is as you know, a evolutionary technique to generate software by Darwinian competition. Sure. And I ordered the book, and I became fascinated with evolutionary software and evolutionary computation in general. I did enough to implement some very simple genetic algorithms, which are remarkably simple in their inner implementations. And then I read a couple other books that came out, all of them that had a Santa Fe Institute nexus. Melanie Mitchell's book. Then I read Stuart Kaufman's book, 2 books on self-organizing networks, the edge of chaos theories, et cetera. And so I go, shoot, this is really interesting stuff. And so when I was inventorying my interests right before I stepped away from Network Solutions, I said, I'm going to become an evolutionary computation jock. And there was so much unexplored in this area that, even an amateur like me could have an impact. And so I did. And the first thing I chose to do was to, after scanning the literature, was to build evolutionary neural nets. It was pretty radical at the time. This was before the neural net frenzy, right? In fact, neural nets were kind of out of fashion in 2001 when I started to do this work. But I found a very interesting body of work at the University of Texas, which is still one of the leading centers for evolutionary neural nets, and wrote my own from scratch, as I like to do, because I really want to understand how software works. When I'm first starting in a field, I don't want to use a framework. I want to actually implement it myself all the way down to the lowest level. And I did, and the damn thing worked. I actually evolved game-playing agents for Othello using Darwinian competition on these hybrid genetic algorithms that encoded neural nets. And somebody I knew from my business days was a reporter at the New York Times, and he thought this was damn interesting. So he wrote a story for the New York Times, said internet CEO is doing what, or something like that. I don't remember the exact title. And it was a pretty good story. And that came to the attention of the people at the Santa Fe Institute. After about 2 years, quickly got pulled into the governance side of the Santa Fe Institute, became a trustee, and then the vice chairman. Then I was chairman of the Institute for a few years. And then I retired again in 2012 and moved back to Virginia. I started thinking about complexity in about 1996, 97 from a business perspective. I actually started using complexity as a lens even then for some of my business work.
First of all, it's a fascinating story to a fascinating career. I want to maybe, double click on something that you said that caught my attention. The difference between interactions and information. Can you double click on that for us so that we can build on that a little bit?
Yeah, this was, my insight at the source, which was what people were paying for and they couldn't get anywhere else. What I would now describe, which I didn't have the vocabulary for then, was signaling networks. That are dynamic, and that there are flows of signals going across these dynamics, and the emergent results of signals on networks were of value. Now, it's a fairly abstract way to describe, for instance, chat online or a bulletin board or the earliest social media. But that's what they were. I mean, the affordance that we had on offer was the ability for people to inject signal and to receive signal. And the topologies were topologies that had never been able to be done before because of the nature of many-to-many communications mediated by networks. And so that was what was unique in the world. Yes, the ability to look up the status of a congressional bill. Yeah, but you could do that at the library if you wanted to. It's somewhat useful. You could look up a stock price, but you could get the date. In those days, people looked up the stock price in the daily newspaper, and that was good enough. And we did have some interest in those products, but it wasn't truly unique. That was the one-to-many publishing model that, again, I will say I made plenty of money in that in my career, providing information to Wall Street and corporate America. But even in those worlds, I always tried to add the many-to-many component where the dynamic signaling across a topology, particularly where the topology could self-organize, was very valuable. So that's what that's a distinction. Many-to-many versus one-to-many, that the value proposition is emergent from the signals rather than being a static thing itself.
Got it. And now, so the many-to-many versus one-to-many, that's an interesting perspective. Can we categorize, I mean, I don't want to be simplistic, but at the risk of sounding that, is information, would you categorize information as an entity, whereas interactions is the aspect of how those entities work with each other, and what comes out of that, the emergence from those entities, playing with each other?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that way to categorize it. In fact, that's perfectly reasonable. I mean, if we go to go back to Shannon, right? Shannon information is at the level of a specific transaction, right? So something arrives that is somewhat or significantly unexpected or unusual, has Shannon information value to it. Like we could be more naive. I get an email from my mother, right? And she tells me something that she's going on vacation to Spain, which I did not know before, right? So the payload is that piece of that thing is information. But when it reaches me, I now process it, and maybe I send it along to my brother. I say, "You think our mother should really be traveling by herself? She's getting a little dotty, right?" I have a side conversation with my brother, and we go, "Well, we better have her doctor check her out before she goes," right? Which we did. And so one piece of information, a quantum of information, flows on the network, which gets processed by a processing node, me, which produces some other signals to both my brothers, back and forth and around and about as we discuss this issue, produces an action, which is, me being the old one, always gets the dirty job, calling my mother up and say, "Hey, Ma, sounds like fun going to Spain, but we'd really feel a lot better if you had your doctor give you a going over before you went." And she said, "Okay." And so there's a simple-minded example of how quanta of information traveling on the network, being processed at each node and potentially generating new messages, produces an emergent result, which in this case was an action.
Sure. No, I think this is fascinating. And this just when we work with many of the Fortune 500 companies, what we find, Jim, is that the first question that they ask is never the right question. And as you dig more and more deeper into the overall problem space, there is an emergence that happens as you see all the interactions between the various things that create a certain outcome. So we find this aspect of complexity, which is probably directly proportional to the number of interactions that are available out there, being a key component in the element of emergence happening. And the most valuable insights, Jim, seem to come from the most amount of surprise that happens at emergence. So it's fascinating. Now I want to take this perspective and build on it a little bit. And we are in a world where people talk about intelligence quite a bit. AI is becoming part and parcel of every conversation. Just like boards were asking, like, we have to do something about internet, probably boards are now saying we got to do something about AI. So in such a world, I find AI to be one of the oldest new things. Uh, what where do you see the state of AI today? And are we in for more disappointment given the amount of buzz around it? What's your perspective on that?
I don't remember who said it, but I think AI fits in that category that will be probably disappointed in the short term, but amazed in the longer term. I've been involved with the most extreme variety of AI, which is artificial general intelligence, and have been affiliated with the OpenCog project, Ben Goertzel and his crew of maniacs for some time, and have done a lot of thinking and reading about it. After engaging with that project, I then took about a 6-year excursion into cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, and gave myself a education in those domains that's very wide and a bit deep. I read maybe 100 books and 300 papers, and met with dozens of world-class scholars. And I now have a pretty good understanding of how human cognition and how neuroscience supports it, which amazingly enough ended up getting me a position on the board of visitors for MIT's Brain and Cognitive Science Department. So I have even more access to some of the best brains in the world. So my view is that artificial general intelligence, i.e. human and beyond level of AI, is indeed feasible. On the other hand, and part of that's, and I think of all my quotes, the one I hope becomes famous, and not snail mail, God damn it, right? But is that supposedly I am the person that coined the term snail mail, and I think that's probably true. I would prefer to be known for saying that humans are to the first order the stupidest possible general intelligence. If we look, general intelligence, I believe, is a bright line that separates humans from everything else on our planet today. But my nature is seldom profligate with her evolutionary gifts. So there's no real reason to expect we'd be very far across that line. And if we know anything about cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, there's many, many obvious weaknesses in human cognition. Perhaps the easiest to explain is working memory. Famous 7 plus or minus 2. As it turns out, it's more like 4 plus or minus 1, which are the number of chunks that you can actually work with fluidly simultaneously. And it turns out that working memory is a gigantic gating factor on language. That's why phrases can only be so long. That's why when we read a paragraph, we don't really understand it, right? We get a sense of it, but we don't really understand it. It's quite reasonable to imagine an artificial general intelligence having, well, step back a little bit, but let's use Miller's 7 plus or minus 2, and the usual flag on that is the village idiot is a 5 and Einstein is a 9, right? In terms of the size of their working memory size. What does 100 look like? Or 1,000,000? And I can think of no fundamental algorithmic reason that an artificial general intelligence couldn't have a working set size of 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000. And at 1,000,000 or even at 1,000, you could read a book and actually fully understand it. No human can read a book and fully understand it because they just get a sense running through this little keyhole of seven words at a time, basically. Other example of the weakness of human cognition is our memory. It's very sparse. What we actually remember is way less than what we actually experience. Secondly, every time we access a memory, we corrupt it accidentally. Lots of good lab research that proves this is true. There's absolutely no reason that an artificial intelligence should have as low fidelity of memory as we do. And it's certainly the case that we'd not want accidental modification of memory during access. Now, we may want to update a memory during access, but we wouldn't want to just accidentally add random noise to it, which appears to happen in human cognition. So for those reasons, I believe there's lots of room above human in the domain of artificial intelligence. Let me speak a little bit to where I think we are today, which is a couple of very simple but important breakthroughs were made around neural nets. The adoption of ReLU as the transfer function, which then allowed back propagation to be implemented on GPUs. I mean, surprisingly, that one innovation has allowed deep learning to explode in effectiveness. And this was really interesting. Neural nets have been good for certain things, but we'd all been kind of disappointed in how far you could push them. And it turned out it's a matter of scale. It's the old Phil Anderson, one of the fathers of complexity science, statement that more is different. And when you get enough nodes, I mean, some of the GPT-3s, have 1 billion nodes in the models, right? It's just different. You can reach a level of complexity that you could not reach with the previous scale of neural nets that were implemented in straight CPUs. And so this very interesting breakthrough into a new domain of the powerful deep learning is been able to harvest a tremendous amount of low-hanging fruit, shall we say, that was completely inaccessible. We used to have a 2-foot ladder, a 1 meter ladder. Now we have a 10-meter ladder. Wow, we can pick a lot more fruit. But AGI is considerably more than 10 meters off the ground. So I am skeptical of those folks who think that deep learning is the road to AGI. I think it's a hugely important technology. I believe that deep learning will be part of AGI. But I am starting to see some of the best thinkers starting to, including Jeff Hinton himself, move away and say that deep learning is not the answer by itself. We need to recreate something like the symbolic realm, which is probably what allows humans to step across that bright line. Chimps got pretty damn good brains, right? They're really fast, better than humans at certain kinds of cognitive tasks, but they don't have symbols. And I suspect that is the limiting factor of deep learning, at least with respect to its movement to true AGI. So we need to have deep learning. Think of that. Deep learning is much like the unconscious mind. We need to have something analogous to the conscious mind. It may not be the same. It probably isn't the same as our conscious mind, but something that can manipulate things in the symbolic realm and combine the two together in a dynamic dance to get to AGI. On the other hand, it's clear we can do some amazing stuff with just brute force. The one I follow the most closely is self-driving cars.
Yep.
In fact, I'm doing a podcast today with Jim Hackett, the former CEO of Ford, who was brought in to run their electric car division and their self-driving car efforts, et cetera. And he was made CEO, and he just recently left. He's an old friend of mine. And we're going to really explore this in detail. I have regular conversations with people. And I do believe that when we finally do get to level 5 autonomous cars, which probably won't be for another 10 years, it will be very dramatic in terms of how humans perceive AI. Here's a really hard, open-ended, high-risk problem, which has been beaten to death by a whole bunch of tricks, essentially. And God knows how many billions of dollars will have been spent on it by the time we get to level 5, but it'll be a bunch. And then that people will then say, all right, we now know, and just like every new big technology, it'll now cost a lot less to solve the next problem, like robotic hotel cleaners or robotic restaurant servers or elder care people. But it won't be directly on the road to AGI. So I have this very nuanced and kind of mixed view of where things are. Lots and lots of very valuable low-hanging fruit in deep learning, up to self-driving cars level 5, which will be tremendous. But it will require another leap to get to the true AGI or the true AI everyone's been wanting since 1956 at the famous Dartmouth summer seminar, where they thought they were 2 years away.
So tell us a little bit about your perspective on consciousness, and and how would you differentiate it from intelligence?
Very good question. I follow John Searle, the Berkeley philosopher of language, science, and consciousness. And my take, and after having read very widely in the literature, is that consciousness is not a thing. It's rather a process. Searle likes to describe consciousness as like digestion. You can't point to a person and say, there's your digestion. Wrong. Digestion includes your teeth, your tongue, your esophagus, your stomach, your small intestine, your liver, your pancreas, etc.
In other words, consciousness is emergent.
It's emergent. It's a process. It's a biological process of which what we think of as our consciousness is emergent from that process. And the Rutt corollary to Searle's comparison of consciousness to digestion is the final output's often the same. Ha, 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 right? So that's one part. The second is that you have to look at a bigger frame than just consciousness, because consciousness is just a piece part of cognition. As we know from cognitive neuroscience, the actual bandwidth in our conscious brain is remarkably slow, on the order of 50 bits a second. It's like amazing. On the other hand, the processing in our unconscious minds is gigantic. It's, teraflops of equivalent processing going on in parallel behind the scenes. And our cognition is a dance between this conscious frame and these unconscious frames going on at an effective. My model basically discretizes the interactions, which is false because it's actually not synchronized. But you can actually get a fairly interesting model. You discretize these interactions on the order of 25 milliseconds, so call it 40 hertz movement of things in and out of the conscious frame. And now, of course, the chimp brain, or even any mammal brain, also has consciousness. And again, this is the Searlean view. Consciousness is nothing new. And in fact, the current best thinking is consciousness analogous to ours goes all the way back to at least reptiles and possibly amphibians. But the conscious contents differ between different animals. And so what's new, I believe, in humans, and what allowed us to cross the line. And in this, I follow Terence Deacon, a book that's not as well known as it should be. It's called The Symbolic Species, where he lays out a very convincing case that the main difference between a chimp and a human is a circuitry to do symbols, and that we now have a new class of conscious contents called symbols. And that's all. It's probably not just quite all, because there's then a co-evolutionary arms race between minimal symbols and full language, I would say, that happened remarkably quickly. But that's essentially my view on consciousness.
In a world today where we are being tested more than ever on responsiveness, we see Boltzmann and entropy playing such a big role in our life. And we are moved from a economies of scale, bigger is better world, to an economies of speed, world. In such a world where we are being tested on responsiveness, I feel, maybe the audience needs to hear a little bit about your, Game B ideology. Can you maybe, tell us a little bit about that and how it relates to, and how its relevance has increased so much more every day that each business is running today?
Yeah, our Game B view has got many aspects to it, but the big picture is that Game A, the game we're currently playing, which, keep it simple, we can say started around 1700 with modern finance, modern science, and the very beginnings of democracy and market and financialized markets, started in a world when there were no limits. Mankind was very poor. Most humans lived on dirt floor huts, if they had that, smoky rooms, on the edge of starvation. And that was in the West. It was worse in other places. And so the idea that there were limits to growth was laughable. Every step to improve human existence was worth taking without even considering the longer term consequences. And so this system got stronger and stronger and stronger. And this is kind of funny, where I'll be talking both sides, right? Which is this thing of velocity. I'm a great believer of from a business perspective. In fact, the notes I created for this conversation, I was going to talk about my discovery. I mean, I didn't discover it, but I discovered it through research, something called the OODA loop, John Boyd's work on formalizing how one could think about velocity, observe, orient, decide, and act.
Yeah.
And
we follow that quite a bit in Mu Sigma.
Yeah, and I've been using that lens for a number of years, and in fact, I built a mild formalism of multi-layered OODA loops, right? And they run at different clock speeds as appropriate to process their domains. On the other hand, and I practice that. I use that when I build an organization. I'm always looking for, what do I need to observe? What do I need, and try to use and filter out a lot of information. Too much information is worse than no information sometimes, especially if velocity is the game. And today it is. On the flip side, Game B would say we have to learn to develocitize our world. That if we don't stop our depredations on the ecosystem, it's a scary number, the majority of the large mammal biomass on Earth today is humans and our domestic animals. 85% of the bird mass on Earth, all of it, is our domestic poultry. We are at the limits. And if we don't and we're also at the cognitive limits. I mean, I would argue some of the chaos in the world that we're seeing is that the social media platforms and things related to them are now swamping the cognitive ability of the just barely generally intelligent human. And so we have to consciously develocitize. So while I'm a great believer in the tactical benefits of velocity, in fact, we apply them within Game B to let Game B be more faster at undermining Game A, at the meta strategic level, I believe it's bad for humanity to remain on an exponential velocity curve. So I kind of talk out of both sides of my mouth here. Tactically, velocity is a wonderful tool today. It's the best tool. In fact, back in Thomson, one of my business units was in a kind of staid business. We were number 3 or 4 in the league tables. And my analysis was the right strategy was to massively increase the velocity of the ecosystem. I called it the product machine gun approach, because we had a weak product, it made sense for us to invest in a much better product and a whole fleet of products. And our assessment was these other companies were not prepared or capable of responding. And very amazingly rapidly, we destroyed them all, bought them all for a salvage price, and dominated this, not that big, but $20 million market, but 50% profit margin by intentionally throwing the lever of velocity very far forward and building an organization capable of operating at, literally 3 or 4 times the velocity of our competitors. But it's a trap we've been caught into. It's an agent-based, game theoretical problem. That if I win by out-velocitying you, you need to learn to out-velocity me. And these game theoretical traps are what Game B highlights as the fundamental, we call generator function of exponential risk. And that if humans don't get on top of these game theoretic things that we're playing with each other, in which velocity is clearly one of them, we're going to destroy ourselves.
One of the biggest challenges that I find in many of our organizations that we work with all Fortune 500 companies, Jim. And one thing which I find the hardest one is that innovation inside a hierarchical organization and risk taking inside a hierarchical organization to a large extent it has become very, very difficult, because the entire budgeting process is based on an ROI mechanism, a return on investment mechanism.
From the time I was 25-year-old working at the source.
And how did you beat that? How did you beat the ROI trap?
Most business books are crap, as you probably know.
Yeah.
But there's a few that are indispensable, one of which is Clayton Christensen's book, The Innovator's Dilemma, where he lays out the fact that the incumbents who control the budgets for the current product that makes the money for the company, will never invest enough in the upstart that would cannibalize our own business. It's a very famous result, and I would say it's the general form of just what you're talking about.
Sure.
So one of the things we did at Thomson, a couple things we did at Thomson, several things. One, we did not use GAAP accounting as our metric. We instead decided, okay, what metric are we really interested in? And we used a metric of cash on cash return. And it's a different kind of ROI, but it gives you a very different set of behaviors than if you're trying to manage the GAAP accounting. Now, interestingly, that also worked at Network Solutions because we were a subscription-based business, kind of like a lot of the Thomson businesses. We got our cash in advance. Our marginal costs are relatively low. We were in a growth industry. And one of the ways I grew the value of the stock was in my quarterly analyst meeting, where I would always say, we had a good quarter in GAAP, but the real story here is cash on cash return. And so manage for cash rather than for GAAP, because GAAP is an arbitrary fiction. For certain kinds of relatively static businesses that process physical inventory and produce final product, GAAP accounting is actually meaningful. But in most businesses, particularly intangible businesses, it can be very distorting and leads you to underinvest. For instance, at Network Solutions, the previous CEO had been modulating the amount of advertising that we did based on GAAP accounting. And my initial, as soon as I got in there, I looked at this thing, that's crazy. You essentially want to be, because it's a transaction-based direct response marketing model, you can track exactly when I put this much advertising out and do it this way, I get this much cash back within 2 weeks, right? So I said, hell no, we're going to push the advertising budget up until the marginal expense of cash on advertising equals the marginal expense on cash from that last quantum of advertising. And within 6 months, we were the second biggest advertiser on the internet. Little old Network Solutions. The only one bigger was Ford Motor Company. And that was just a perspective of change. Don't worship GAAP. Use a different framework. The other one is don't worship profit margin. And I would say I learned this at Thomson also. I learned it at my startups before Thomson as well, which is you really, to think about the value of an enterprise, and think formally about, say, a publicly traded company, it's the value is the net present value, future positive cash flows. And so take seriously the future. And cranking down the margins to the highest possible degree today is not generally the answer. Well, I'll step up a little bit. First, you have to understand what kind of co-evolutionary fitness landscape you're in. If you're in a fast-changing co-evolutionary fitness landscape, which is frankly most businesses today, then you should not ratchet your profit margin down as far as you can. Instead, you should explicitly allocate a percentage of your cash flow to use for revolutionarily reinventing your business. And Thomson did this. We, as I said, we were in this kind of 4 companies in information publishing. 3 out of the 4 tried to optimize their profit margins. We operated about 1.5% less profitable than they did. And that generated for us $150 million a year of free cash flow, which we could allocate without any inhibition. And I was the main person for quite a while who was dishing this money out. There are a couple other people who had to co-approve it, but truthfully, they just did what I told them. And the ability to slapdash $150 million a year into attacking ourselves, reinventing our businesses, taking businesses that had tremendous potential but were under-resourced and just pushing some great resources into them was a gigantic advantage and allowed us to defeat Christensen's innovator's dilemma, because you could come to Jim, and if you could convince him that this was transformational, you didn't have to get the money out of your business unit. Sure. We had this alternative way of funding. Of course, we also had a very rigid way of shooting things, right? If you fund innovative ideas, just like a VC, 75% of them aren't going to work. So we had a gate process that whenever we gave money, we had a gate. You didn't get through the gate, we shot you. Oh, well, right. And so not optimizing on profit margin if you are in a fast changing world, and taking that difference in profit margin and using it for growth. So again, if you think about value, it's growth and margin. I'd rather have the extra growth and a nice margin rather than try to ratchet out the last bit of profit and losing innovation.
No, I think, Jim, I think what you're saying is, you don't you have enough profits, but use some of the profits for optionality, and continuously be creating optionality. And so I think very many of the Fortune 500 companies today, while they have an ROI mindset, moving them to a return on option mindset, becomes really, really difficult. And I guess that's why I think the world is going to continuously be so friendly to founders, because they have this disproportionate amount of ability to take risks and make things happen. Jim, I want to thank you for today. It's been a fascinating ride, all the way from thinking about the initial journey from where the internet got started to all the way to how you think about complexity, consciousness, the value of symbols, and last but not the least, thinking about the game B ideology and how we should orient ourselves for responsiveness. I can't thank you enough, and I'm sure that all the people in the MusicMy ecosystem will value this quite a bit. Thanks again for your time today.
That was great. I enjoyed it.